The hall blazed with light, and laughter scraped like metal as Ethan Cole carried a tray that felt heavier than silver. The narrator said, "They mocked his hunger and mistook it for shame." Victoria Harrington said, "Do not drop the crystal. It costs more than your month." Ethan said, "It will be safe." Lord Edward Harrington tapped his cane and said, "Order, not chatter." Nora Bly watched from the pillar and wrote a quick line, then looked up again. A small, cracked seal slid from Ethan's pocket, kissed the marble and rang like a coin on the last bet. Victoria said, "A toy?" Daniel Reed near the lift said, "Not a toy!" A sign. The crowd leaned in, smelling a scene. Margaret Cole, behind the kitchen door, whispered a prayer to steady the air. The narrator said, "The seal had waited years to be heard, and tonight the stone listened." The narrator said, "After the ring, the hall wanted a victim." Victoria Harrington said, "Pick it up and make it fast." Ethan Cole knelt and set the tray down with care. Lord Edward Harrington said, "Explain yourself." Ethan said, "It belonged to a friend of my father." Nora Bly edged forward and traced the crest in the air as if the lions were smoke. Daniel Reed said, "Old signs choose their hour." A guard reached for Ethan, then stopped, waiting for a nod. The crowd pressed close for a better view of the small thing that held their big pride. Margaret Cole pressed her palm to the door and prayed the door would not break before the night was done. The narrator said, "Hunger bends, but it does not crawl." The narrator said, "Power asked for a name, and silence answered first." Lord Edward Harrington said, "Speak clearly." Ethan Cole said, "You already know me." Victoria Harrington said, "He serves, and that is the end." Nora Bly said, "Service is not the end of a name." Daniel Reed said, "Let him finish, then judge." A server cart rolled by with a soft clink, and the sound felt like a clock. Margaret Cole stood still behind the door and held a folded paper that had outlived many storms. The narrator said, "Small papers make large cracks," Ethan said. "Ask about the crest, not me." Lord Edward's mouth set hard. Victoria's smile lost its shine. The seal waited like a witness who had learned patience. The narrator said, "Jokes make walls until questions strike them." Victoria Harrington said, "No one here cares for old wax." Ethan Cole said, "Old wax keeps faith longer than talk." Lord Edward Harrington said, "Mind the line between worker and guest." Nora Bly said, "Lines move when truth enters." Daniel Reed said, "Heat makes a seal speak." The guard hovered for a cue that did not come. Margaret Cole touched the paper at her waist and drew strength from the crease that never tore. The narrator said, "A mother's pocket can shame a vault," Ethan said. "Let me finish my shift and I will leave." Victoria waved, but her eyes stayed on the seal like a moth on glass. The narrator said, "Rain wrote lines on the glass while pride wrote lines on faces." Lord Edward Harrington said, "Remove him." Ethan Cole said, "I will walk." Victoria Harrington said, "Take the trinket and do not return." Nora Bly said, "I will record who laughed and who looked away." Daniel Reed said, "Doors close, hinges remember." Margaret Cole stepped into the light and said, "My son leaves with dignity." The word son moved the room like a breeze in dust. The guard lowered his hand at a small nod. The narrator said, "The first fall is never the last." Ethan set the tray, took the seal, and faced the exit. Silence lifted, thin but honest, like a sky after storm. The narrator said, "Rain chased Ethan Cole down the steps, and the city watched like a judge." Margaret Cole said, "Walk beside me." Ethan said, "I will not bow." Nora Bly kept to the curb and said, Pride is loud tonight. Daniel Reed said, noise can hide a door. Victoria Harrington stood under the awning and said, remember your place. Lord Edward Harrington said, close the gates. The narrator said, iron can close, yet truth still seeps through. Ethan held the seal tight and said, I will find what it means. Margaret said, then we go to the streets that remember names. The rain hammered, and the night stretched like a test that would not end. The narrator said, morning gave no mercy, only bills. Margaret Cole said, the landlord will come by noon. Ethan Cole said, I will try the docks and the bakery. Nora Bly said, I will ask quiet people and learn loud truths. Daniel Reed leaned on the stair rail and said, work has a price when a rich name whispers. Victoria Harrington said, no shop takes the boy with the seal. Lord Edward Harrington said, let the city teach him limits. The narrator said, limits sound like fences until a hinge loosens. Ethan said, if doors shut, I will find a window. Margaret said, keep dignity, even if bread is thin. The room smelled of damp, but the will in it was dry and sharp. The narrator said, shops turned their faces like shutters. A baker said no, and then said nothing more. Ethan Cole said, I can lift sacks before dawn. A dock clerk glanced at a list and shook his head. Nora Bly said, rumor walks faster than men. Daniel Reed said, a name has been sent ahead of you. Victoria Harrington said, standards must be kept. Lord Edward Harrington said, let him feel the shape of refusal. The narrator said, refusal is sand that blunts the feet, but it cannot blunt a vow. Ethan said, I will not sell the seal. Margaret Cole said, then keep it close and keep your head high. The street replied with cold wind and newsprint that stuck to shoes. The narrator said, when doors end, alleys begin. Daniel Reed said, there is a clerk who loves old paper. Nora Bly said, archivists hide revolutions in drawers. Ethan Cole said, then we ask without fear. Margaret Cole said, speak steady, let truth hold your spine. Victoria Harrington told the driver, follow them and report. Lord Edward Harrington said, burn the rumor if it turns to flame. The narrator said, fire our fears water, but paper loves a careful hand. Ethan said, if the seal belongs, the record will know. Daniel said, name scratched once can scratch again. They turned toward the records hall, and the city turned with them. The narrator said, the records hall smelled of dust and thunder. A clerk frowned at the seal, then fetched a key. Ethan Cole said, please check the crest index. Margaret Cole said, stand tall. Nora Bly said, I will note the exact entry. Daniel Reed said, if ink remembers, tonight it speaks. Victoria Harrington entered the foyer and said, this search is a waste. Lord Edward Harrington's voice carried from behind and said, close that drawer. The clerk said, it cannot close until it opens. The narrator said, some drawers hold storms. Ethan said, read the old clause. The room held its breath, and the hallway echoed like a drum before a verdict. The narrator said, the clerk gripped the ledger like it might bite. Lord Edward Harrington said, close that book. Ethan Cole said, let the index speak. Victoria Harrington slid a velvet purse and said, speed is elegant. Nora Bly said, I will record the time and the hand. Daniel Reed said, gold buys silence, but not memory. Margaret Cole said, truth does not fear a window. The clerk glanced at the door and shook, then turned a brittle page. the narrator said. Fear wrote faster than ink, Lord Edward said. Names vanish in damp, Ethan said. Not if wax held them. Victoria frowned, and the purse stayed heavy in her palm. The narrator said, by noon the landlord arrived with a new smile. Victoria Harrington said, our company owns this block now. Lord Edward Harrington said, order brings cleanliness. Ethan Cole said, we paid what we could. The landlord waved a notice like a flag. No one saluted. Margaret Cole said, give us 1 week. Nora Bly said, I will note the date and the change of deed. Daniel Reed said, power buys doors, not respect. The narrator said, eviction knocks with soft knuckles when it feels sure. Ethan said, I will find wages and proof. Victoria said, find a miracle? The paper shook, but not in the wind. The narrator said, the market heard the news before its bells. Victoria Harrington said, no one hires a thief of names. Lord Edward Harrington stood at the curb and said, standards protect us. Ethan Cole said, I stole nothing. A grocer shrugged and looked away. Nora Bly said, I will print the refusals with their hours. Daniel Reed said, shame travels fast, and truth limps. Margaret Cole said, we will not beg. The narrator said, pride is heavy, yet it keeps the spine straight. Ethan said, I will carry it. Victoria smiled thin and left a coin that felt like a slap on the counter. The narrator said, when doors stayed shut, they hunted for cracks. Daniel Reed said, there is a basement index no one cleans. Nora Bly said, dust keeps secrets honest. Ethan Cole said, show me the drawer that sticks. Margaret Cole said, do not rush the page. A clerk muttered about rules, then coughed when Lord Edward's name was spoken. Victoria Harrington said, you waste ink. The narrator said, waste grows into roots when watered. Ethan found a card with half a line and a torn corner. Daniel said, someone pulled a tooth. Nora said, then we ask why the mouth aches. The narrator said, night wrapped the block like cloth over a wound. Ethan Cole said, they fear the reading. Margaret Cole said, then we ask for light. Daniel Reed said, call the gallery where the rich clap for names. Nora Bly said, I will invite witnesses and keep the clock. Victoria Harrington said, invite who you like. Lord Edward Harrington said, we do not answer to street theatrics. The narrator said, a stage appears where courage stands still. Ethan said, tomorrow we read the crest before eyes that judge. Margaret touched his sleeve and nodded once. The seal felt warm again, like a promise made aloud. The narrator said, the gallery filled with eyes and old air. Ethan Cole said, read the crest book. The clerk set the ledger on a stand and stepped back. Margaret Cole said, hold steady. Nora Bly said, time noted. Daniel Reed said, let truth walk in front. Victoria Harrington said, this is a show. Lord Edward Harrington said, end it now. The narrator said, shows end when the curtain drops, and this curtain was wax. The seal lay beside the index card like a twin that had been lost. Ethan said, match it. The clerk lifted a glass lamp, and the light found the crack. Silence stretched. Pride held its breath. The night waited at the door like a judge who knew the verdict already. The narrator said, the lamp glass warmed and ink woke. The clerk said, crest code H14, Harrington line. Ethan Cole said, read the clause. Victoria Harrington said, there is no clause. Lord Edward Harrington said, close the book. Nora Bly said, I record H14, Daniel Reed said. We keep going, Margaret Cole said. Do not fear, ink. The clerk turned a thin page with shaking fingers. The narrator said, paper shook, but truth did not. The seal's crack fit the registry sketch like a scar meeting its mirror. Ethan said, there. The room shifted, small and sharp, like a blade rolling in a drawer. The narrator said, names rose from the page like ships from fog. The clerk read, inheritance held for the forgotten line. Ethan Cole said, define the line. Margaret Cole closed her eyes and opened them again. Margaret said, your father kept a promise to a dying friend. Victoria Harrington said, lies from a maid. Lord Edward Harrington said, remove her. Nora Bly said, she speaks on the record. Daniel Reed said, say it plain. Margaret said, say it plain. You were hidden to protect you, the narrator said. A secret is a house with a locked room. Ethan whispered, I was not wrong to keep the seal. Pride cracked, and the crack sounded like relief. The narrator said, power met proof and blinked. Victoria Harrington said, this clause is old and dead. Lord Edward Harrington said, the court will laugh it out. Ethan Cole said, the seal is the witness. Nora Bly said, I will publish the image and the line. Daniel Reed said, courts read faster when light is bright. Margaret Cole said, mercy first, then claim. The clerk pointed to a note in the margin. The narrator said, a small note can break a throne. The note read, estate to one who feeds hunger before profit. Ethan said, I understand. Pride shifted to purpose, and the room felt new. The narrator said, the gallery became a court without robes. Lord Edward Harrington said, you will not touch our vault. Victoria Harrington said, walk away while you can. Ethan Cole said, I will honor the clause. Nora Bly said, witnesses present and named. Daniel Reed said, feed hunger first, then unlock doors. Margaret Cole said, begin with the kitchen. The clerk nodded and sealed a copy with fresh wax. The narrator said, old wax met new fire. Ethan placed the cracked seal beside the copy. Ethan said, tomorrow we open the hall to those who wait outside. Pride lost its mask. The night did not end. It changed shape. The narrator said, the great hall woke like a beast. Chandeliers hummed. Marble held the echo of boots. Ethan Cole said, bring the ledger and the vault key. Lord Edward Harrington said, you command nothing. Victoria Harrington said, he plays air in borrowed light. Margaret Cole said, truth does not borrow. Nora Bly said, I witness the demand and the refusal. Daniel Reed said, then open the door and end the talk. The guard looked to the cane and paused. The narrator said, power checked its pulse. Ethan said, the clause requires mercy first. He lifted the seal. The hall seemed to lean toward it. Pride grew quiet. Fear made a small sound and hid behind silk. The narrator said, the vault waited like a closed throat. A key shivered on a velvet hook. Ethan Cole said, feed the kitchens first. Victoria Harrington said, charity is theater. Lord Edward Harrington said, this house feeds shareholders. Margaret Cole said, hunger stands at the door. Nora Bly said, I record the order to open stores. Daniel Reed said, turn the key, or the crowd will. The narrator said, a clause is a blade when spoken aloud. Ethan said, unlock food, then we speak of gold. The cane lifted, then fell. The butler nodded. Metal sighed. Pride tasted iron. The door began to move. The narrator said, bread broke the stalemate. Carts rolled from the pantry like slow thunder. Ethan Cole said, send the first loaves to the street. Margaret Cole said, begin with the night shift. And the gate guards, Victoria Harrington said, you buy applause with crumbs. Lord Edward Harrington said, close it before the press arrives. Nora Bly said, the press is here. Daniel Reed said, mercy first, then ledgers. The narrator said, mercy is loud when rooms are hungry. Lids lifted, steam rose like banners. The hall breathed. Ethan said, now bring the will. The seal lay ready beside the flour dust. The narrator said, paper returned with teeth. The will lay on oak like a map of storms. Ethan Cole said, read the condition again. Lord Edward Harrington said, this farce ends. Victoria Harrington said, no court will hold it. Nora Bly said, clause confirmed and witnessed. Daniel Reed said, the heir serves before he takes. Margaret Cole said, he has served. The narrator said, service turned the lock inside the house. The clerk pointed to the margin note and the crest code. Ink shone, air stilled. Ethan said, I claim the duty and the debt. The room accepted the weight and did not break. The narrator said, the last wall stood at the vault ledger. Lord Edward Harrington said, you will not master this house. Victoria Harrington said, take your bread and leave. Ethan Cole said, I take the burden and the audit. Margaret Cole said, do it clean. Nora Bly said, witnesses remain. Daniel Reed said, open the book. The ledger revealed debts hidden under polish. The narrator said, numbers confess when light is firm. Ethan said, we pay the workers and the small vendors first. The cane did not move. Pride fell back a step. The seal touched the leather. The house chose. The narrator said, morning reached the estate like a soft judge. Ethan Cole said, unlock the kitchens and call the staff. Margaret Cole said, begin with those who waited longest. Nora Bly said, I will list the names and the hours. Daniel Reed said, vendors stand outside with old invoices. Victoria Harrington said, charity will drain the vault. Lord Edward Harrington said, spend and we fall. The narrator said, spend and we fall. The narrator said, bread does not weaken stone, it steadies it. Ethan said, pay wages first and post the ledger. Margaret said, let the doors stay open. Nora said, witnesses gather by the gate. The house listened. The seal rested on the counter like a quiet oath. The narrator said, workers filled the hall with careful steps. Ethan Cole said, take what is owed and sign for it. A cook wiped her eyes and smiled without words. Margaret Cole said, no one leaves unpaid. Nora Bly said, no one leaves unpaid. I will photograph each receipt. Daniel Reed said, small vendors first, then larger notes. Victoria Harrington said, this is not business. Lord Edward Harrington said, this is weakness. The narrator said, strength is a roof that does not leak. Ethan said, if the roof holds, the books will follow. Margaret pressed the ink pad across the table. Nora's flash clicked. The line moved like a river that finally found its mouth. The narrator said, by noon, carts rolled to the gate with hot bread. Ethan Cole said, serve the street first. Children laughed when steam touched cold air. Margaret Cole said, share without counting. Nora Bly said, record the queue and the smiles. Daniel Reed said, keep one table for the night shift. Victoria Harrington said, applause will fade. Lord Edward Harrington said, debt will not, the narrator said. Service is a stone that does not sink, Ethan said. We balance the books with fairness and work. The guards stepped aside and tasted the meal. The gate felt wider. The city felt closer, the narrator said. Afternoon brought the auditors and their pens. Ethan Cole said, open every ledger and cupboard. Margaret Cole said, show them the stores and the debts. Nora Bly said, I will note what is found and what is fixed. Daniel Reed said, we will map each promise to a date. Victoria Harrington said, you perform for the crowd. Lord Edward Harrington said, you expose us. The narrator said, you expose us. The narrator said, light is not a show, it is a tool. Ethan said, if we must answer, we answer in full. Pages turned, locks clicked, ink dried. The house stopped hiding and began to breathe with its windows open. The narrator said, evening folded over the estate like a calmer sky. Ethan Cole said, post the new terms on the door. Wages stood first, then vendors, then the rest. Margaret Cole said, let the kitchen stay open each night. Nora Bly said, I will publish the record and the clause. Daniel Reed said, the street will test our promise. Victoria Harrington said, you stole a crown with bread. Lord Edward Harrington said, history will not accept you. The narrator said, history accepts what is done. Ethan said, let the hungry come tomorrow. The seal lay mended on oak beside warm loaves. The house chose, and the choice held. The narrator said, dawn found the estate quiet and brave. Ethan Cole said, post the ledger where all can see. Margaret Cole said, let the doors breathe. Nora Bly said, I will publish the clause and the proof. Daniel Reed said, vendors are at the gate with fresh notes. Victoria Harrington said, you buy love with loaves. Lord Edward Harrington said, time will break your show. The narrator said, time breaks pride first. Ethan said, we pay what is owed and keep accounts open. Margaret said, mercy is a habit. Nora said, names matter when written clear. Daniel said, today will hold. Victoria watched the hall like it had betrayed her. Lord Edward counted steps and found none to climb. The narrator said, the first dispute arrived with a shout. A supplier waved an old invoice. Ethan Cole said, show the date and we pay in order. Margaret Cole said, water first, then grain, then fuel. Nora Bly said, I record each choice. Daniel Reed said, we fix the leak before we paint. Victoria Harrington said, you will drown in costs. Lord Edward Harrington said, let them learn limits. The narrator said, limits bend when hearts do not. Ethan said, fairness is not a speech. Margaret said, it is a sequence. Nora said, paper will hold the memory. Daniel said, hands will hold the work. The gate quieted. Storms moved to lines and stamps. The narrator said, by noon the kitchen sang. Children laughed at steam. Ethan Cole said, see at night workers first. Margaret Cole said, save 2 trays for the gate guards. Nora Bly said, record who served and who ate. Daniel Reed said, bread moves faster than rumor. Victoria Harrington said, you cannot feed the city. Lord Edward Harrington said, this is waste. The narrator said, then no. Waste is gold that forgot its use. Ethan said, we honor the clause. Margaret said, and we teach the house to breathe. Nora said, the list grows. Daniel said, so does trust. The street listened. The hall felt honest and wide. The narrator said, afternoon brought the reckoning. An auditor pointed at numbers buried like bones. Ethan Cole said, "List the debts without fear." Margaret Cole said, "We pay wages, then small shops, then the rest." Nora Bly said, "I will publish the order." Daniel Reed said, "We cut the gala budget and sell the extra cars." Victoria Harrington said, "You strip our shine." Lord Edward Harrington said, "You shame our name." The narrator said, "Shame is old dust, cleaning is new air." Ethan said, "We keep what serves." Margaret said, "We release what binds." Nora said, "Witnessed." Daniel said, "Signed." The room cleared. The room cleared, and light stayed. The narrator said, "Evening laid a quiet hand on the house and did not lift it." Ethan Cole said, "Set one table for anyone who comes late." Margaret Cole said, "Bless the work and rest." Nora Bly said, "Record ends at this hour, but memory goes on." Daniel Reed said, "The city will test us again." Victoria Harrington stood at the threshold and said, "You stole a throne with hunger." Lord Edward Harrington said, "History will forget you." The narrator said, "History remembers what feeds it." Ethan set the mended seal by warm bread and said, "This is the promise." Silence answered, full and kind.